My name is Shireen Malik-Kavzali, she, her pronouns, and I'm the Chief Equity Officer for San Mateo County. Tonight, I'm excited to be here with you today to hear a presentation and conversation with authors and photographer of Seeing Silicon Valley with Mary Beth Meehan and Fred Turner. We'll be able to follow with questions from the audience. Your microphones and your videos will be turned off, but please feel free to use the chat function and submit your questions in the Zoom Q&A on the bottom of your screen. For those who'd like to access live closed caption for the event, click on the CC, then show subtitle. San Mateo County Libraries is excited to host Mary Beth Meehan and Fred Turner. This is a great duo. Mary Beth Meehan is an acclaimed photographer known for her large-scale community-based portraitures centered around questions of representation, visibility, and social equity. Fred Turner is Harry and Norman Chandler Professor of Communication at Stanford University and a Silicon Valley culture expert. Seeing Silicon Valley is an eye-opening collaboration that sets to demystify the heart of the tech world through arresting photography and stories. And we're really excited to have both of you here with us today.
Oh, thanks, Shireen. Nice to be here.
Welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Shireen.
We have a set of questions we thought that we would run by you, but we really encourage the audience to share their questions via the chat function as you're listening to the authors so that you don't forget them. And then we'll be ready to answer those questions once we get to the Q&A section, which we think will be close to about 6:30 or so. So just to start off, can you share a little about this project, how it came to be? How long did it take you and what inspired you to make this?
Sure, Mary Beth, should I start on this one?
Sure, yeah.
So first, hi everybody, and thank you very much, Shireen, and thank you, Jenna, and the library. I think we're pretty darn excited to be here, and especially to be, in a library that is really the civic heart of this region. So I've been a professor at Stanford for about 20 years, and most of my academic work is about Silicon Valley mythology, the stories of what tech is supposed to be doing for us and how it's supposed to enter the world. And in those stories, as in the press, there are frequently these sort of heroic inventor types, and they're mostly white, mostly young, mostly male, and they work, there are people like Elon Musk, not so young anymore, but you get the general idea. And seeing that mythology travel, I'd always known, living in the valley, about 2 miles from Google, how diverse the valley actually is, what a wide range of people there are, and how we may think that technologies spring from the genius of individual minds, but actually they depend on the hands of lots of people who are literally unseen. And so I very much wanted to see those people and help make them visible. And I was very lucky. I got a couple grants, one from Stanford and one from the Wallenberg Foundation, and was able to bring Mary Beth to Stanford, and Mary Beth took it from there, and we worked together. Mary Beth, over to you. You want to add in?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, thank you, Shireen. Thank you, San Mateo Library. And it was really an effort to think about seeing in terms of the myth. So not in terms of one another, in terms of those communities. Oh, that's okay. That always livens things up.
Much sweeter, much sweeter.
What we were interested in, I mean, if you're a family in Mountain View and you're trying to make it and you're working in service at Facebook, your family sees you, your community sees you, you see yourselves. I mean, it wasn't about invisibility. It was more about who is part of the story, and are we seeing the way the economy and those places are affecting the people on whom that whole engine depends. So seeing in terms of really what's the true story of the place? How do we look at those companies and how do we look at the people in them? And why is it important for all Americans, or indeed if people all over the world are going to be emulating Silicon Valley, why is it important for the whole world to see how it actually functions there for the people on the ground? And, you know, Fred had the foresight to think that that was important, and to think that a photographer was someone that he'd want to work with in parsing all that. So that was really the origin of the project.
And it's something that is very visible to many of us that live in the region, but it's a really good point to think about globally. That is not the image of Silicon Valley. That is not the story, and that much of that is very invisible. And so taking that time and the recognition of how important it is to make that visible. We talk a lot locally about the concept of having an hourglass economy, where we have a lot of high-end jobs, and those high-end jobs therefore create a lot of lower-end service jobs that oftentimes have been stagnating in wages. So in many ways, it's not a surprise to see some of the stories that you bring to light in the book. But thinking on a global stage, how that's completely lost.
Yeah, I think something Mary Beth and I are both very alert to is that Silicon Valley is a beacon for America and the rest of the world. It's something that people cite in, you know, everywhere from Shanghai to London as the kind of world we're trying to build. And what you're pointing out, Shireen, is exactly right. This hourglass economy is also what Silicon Valley stands for. Silicon Valley stands for not only technological innovation, but for the rise of inequality across America. And that's something that we need to flag. And yeah.
One of the reasons why I was excited to do this talk with you, Shireen, is because I know about your interest in equity but I do think that outside the region, and maybe I would dare say, I mean, Fred and I have given a lot of talks for different groups right there in Silicon Valley who are sort of flabbergasted to see the inside story of their neighbors. And so I think you bring a particular awareness that may not be shared as broadly locally as we might hope. You know?
I think that's such an important point you raised, that even locally, we all live in very segregated communities. We, in fact, are one of the most segregated counties in California. And so we very much live in our own bubble. And oftentimes in our communities, we don't necessarily experience each other's realities. Right. And so it may be that someone living right in Silicon Valley, participating in this, in the tech world, actually has to pick up this book to learn about where they live, and vice versa. You know, some of us may need to pick up a book and learn about Elon Musk, but that's just much more covered in the stories and the general narrative of the you know, the valley. It just made me think of the LA and how globally people think of Hollywood and they think of these fancy things, but then there's Skid Row and just the largest population of homeless people. So it really is, that is the story you wanted to bring to light.
And I also, that the hourglass, I mean, I think that, you know, the trailers in Mountain View or along the front of the Stanford campus, that stuff has seeped into the consciousness, you know, globally. I think about Silicon Valley, the rise of the homelessness in San Francisco. But what Fred and I really wanted to talk about too were those people in the middle who are also struggling, that being a mid-level engineer is not as easy as one might think because of the way the housing prices have you know, have accelerated, or what's the environmental damage and what's that effect on people. So it's not just the bottom and the top, but also how it affects all workers.
That's right. Maybe I'll just add in one more thing here, but and then we'd love to see if there's any you know, stories that you want to share directly from the book, or any photos you want to share with us. But I came up in the environmental justice world, and I remember learning about point source pollution and the impacts of, let's say, the ports. You have this global good that the ports enable, whether it's in Long Beach or Oakland, but they have the collateral localized damage that often falls on the bodies and communities of local people of color. And if you liken that to the tech world and you think about the Facebooks, the Genentechs, this global good that some of these companies are bringing, they have a very localized impact of increasing housing costs, squeezing out a lot of folks that have lived here for a very long time, and that localized impact is lost on most people. So I
Definitely.
I agree with that. I want to add the environmental piece. You know, Santa Clara County, just one county south of San Mateo, is the single most polluted county in America, though we never talk about it. It has the highest number of Superfund sites, which are extreme pollution sites needing to be cleaned up by the government, of any county in America. And I've been surprised that that's the fact that people know the least about. This is actually, for all its beauty, one of the most polluted county in America.
And that might be your next book, right?
Yeah,
just would be great to see if there's any, if we can see or show us some of the photos that you have, or talk about some of the people.
You bet. Okay, so let me share screen. And then I will hope that you tell me if you can see everything. Can you see a picture?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So this is Abraham and Brenda. And so, Fred had sent me quite a few books to read about Silicon Valley before I came, a lot of research. But when I got there, I was there for 6 weeks in 2017 and then another 2 in 2019. And it was really just boots on the ground, hit the ground running, day and night, just driving around, stopping and talking to people and researching and working with social service providers and people in the public and private sectors who were working with people in the Valley, but also just walking around and talking to people. And I couldn't help but notice this long row of trailers in front of Stanford. And so this is Abraham and Brenda, who, had a home. He had a business that he lost in 2018 during the crash. And he, they had been living in improvised homes in people's yards, and those had all been torn down. And so one after the other, they end up taking their savings and buying this RV and living in this long row of trailers in front of Stanford, which, I think that maybe one preconception is that people have drug problems, or that people, are somehow not functioning in society. And those are the people who are without homes in Silicon Valley. But in fact, many of the people are actually working people. And so, they told me that there was a young woman in their row of trailers that worked in the bookstore at Stanford. I wasn't ever able to find her. And then this is Richard, who, he worked in the auto industry. He came up in the auto industry making $150,000 when his plant in Fremont closes. He ends up getting a job at the same property, but now owned by Tesla. Now he was working, for $18 an hour, making $40,000 a year, and realizing that all of these union-based standards that he had been used to in his previous career were not in place. And so people were hurting themselves. They were working long hours. Guys are living in the cars in the parking lot at Tesla and not getting any benefits. And he started to unionize. The UAW came to Fremont and tried to work with them, and he ended up being let go from the job, and that's on appeal. But so, just thinking about who are all the other workers there in Silicon Valley, the people who are manufacturing the cars at Tesla are also part of the story. And then this is Ravi and Gautami, who come from India and are part of this large Hindu community, that's been growing in, their temple is in Sunnyvale, but that's been growing in Silicon Valley since the 80s. We talk a lot about diversity in Silicon Valley and who has access into the companies. And so these are highly educated, multiple degrees in India as engineers, and they get all the way to Silicon Valley, which is kind of their dream. And then they realize we might not be able to make it here, because they both have jobs in the pharmaceutical engineering industry. They have an apartment that's, $3,000 plus per month, but they want to have a family. And so they're thinking that this dream may not pan out the way they'd hoped because of the costs. And John, who grew up in East Palo Alto, who speaks really clearly about not seeing people like him, not seeing a young Black American from East Palo Alto have access to these corporations that have set up shop in their communities. And so Amazon had set up a huge warehouse or a huge center in East Palo Alto, and was negotiating with the city council how it was going to interact with the city. But there were no real guarantees in place that people that that John knew from growing up in East Palo Alto were going to have access to the company. So he was coming up in engineering and not seeing people like him where he was working, and decided to go back to East Palo Alto and start programs so kids could have access to those companies. But that divide is a really hard thing to kind of describe. Justina comes from Poland with a PhD, and she gets there and she's going to do all of this sort of altruistic disaster response with AI. And she gets to Silicon Valley and she realizes there's no money for anything like disaster response, because this is capitalism. You have to have a product to sell. And so disaster response, you need all of this money put forward up front in order to be able to build the thing, but who's going to pay for it? So she kind of gave up on that dream and is now working in cars and manufacturing. But she talks about how this loss of values, she talks wistfully about, it used to be that we knew what this was all about, what being human was all about, and why are we trying to achieve excellence in technology if we can't achieve excellence in being, fellow human beings, being good to each other, is what she said. And I'll end on Constance, who is a teacher in Menlo Park. And it was really important to me to include some people in the book who are public servants, like fire, police, and education, but who can't afford to live in the town. And so what does that mean in terms of community health, community breakdown, that the people who were serving in the community can't actually be part of the community. So she was commuting 2 hours each way to teach in Menlo Park, but she became, she was entered into this lottery to be part of this Facebook pilot program to provide subsidized housing for Menlo Park teachers. So she's living in right there in Menlo Park, right across from the Facebook campus. She's living in a subsidized teacher apartment. There aren't enough of those to go around, but it feels like a model to me. It felt like a model of hope to us, where a company is trying to invest in the community and trying to think about the overall kind of holistic health of the community that it's landed in. Is exactly what you said, Shireen. The impact that a place like Facebook has had in a community. What's its kind of civic duty to the people who've been affected?
Well, let's
shut in there and chat some more.
Sure.
Okay. Oh shoot, I forgot how to do that. Okay, there we go.
Cool.
Well, thank you. That was really beautiful. Fred, did you want to jump in and say anything about that?
No, I wanted to note the beauty of the photographs. Mary Beth and I have worked together a long time, and one of the nicest things about working with Mary Beth is that we get to collaborate on all pieces. I talk about her photographs, she talks about my writing. The stories are hers, and she recovered those from the subjects. And what I wanted to note was the way the pictures are quite formal, and they really show a kind of warmth and respect between Mary Beth and the people that she's working with. And I say working with very deliberately. One of the things that the Valley does a lot is turn people's lived worlds into technical systems, into social media, into things that can travel as signs. And I think we both care a great deal, Mary Beth and I, about making sure that we respect the embodied lives of the people that we're working with. And I think you just see that in the pictures really clearly. That's
beautiful. And the stories that they're willing to share with you that are very personal, and the trust that can be built. How do you build that trust?
Well, Shireen, we talked a little bit before the start of the webinar of, being a person who presents as white. How do I, what right do I have to be going through the world and making these photos, and trying to, and recognizing kind of the imperial roots of the practice of photography and the destructive potential toward that kind of categorization in the hands of someone is really, it's powerful. And I feel that it brings with it quite a profound responsibility to these people. So, I mean, I do really, really long interviews. I spend a long, long time with people. I often go back, you know, multiple times. Sometimes the picture doesn't happen right away. Sometimes, you know, as in Teresa, I'll show you, you know, Teresa on the cover of the book, you know, I was getting my dinner and I saw her in this food truck where she was working. And I was so struck by her that I asked if I could jump into the food truck and make the portrait. And then I went back to her house later and did long interviews and met her family and all of that. But then sometimes I meet the person up front and we do the interviews and talk for a very long time and then figure out how to make the portrait. So it's just really important to me that when the person sees the photo and reads the text, they feel like I got it, that I didn't miss it, that I didn't put my slant on it, that somehow I was able to hear what they wanted to tell me. And you know, no one stopped me and said, what are you talking about? There's nothing to discuss about Silicon Valley. You know, people say, how did you get people to talk to you? It wasn't that hard to say, what's life like for you here? We think there's a disconnect between what life might be like for you here and what it's seen as by the rest of the world. And everyone has an opinion on that. And everyone wanted to talk about that disconnection. Even the person, when I first went to meet Fred to see if we got along, to see if we were going to do this work, I rented an Airbnb in Mountain View just to meet Fred. And Arifan was the owner of the Airbnb, and we started chatting. And I said I was at Stanford to do this book about what life was like. And she said, sit down, let me make you some tea. Let me tell you what it's like to come from Iran and have everyone at home think that we're so rich. But really, it's really hard here. So I think.
Go
ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay. I want to contrast the way that Mary Beth works with images and people with the ways that social media companies like Facebook or search firms like Google work with people. You know, both of those practices have colonial roots. I mean, photography certainly does, and large-scale information systems for managing populations also have those kinds of roots. But I would argue that in today's environment, the kind of work that Mary Beth does, close up, person to person, in bodies, with images that are made collaboratively, may have colonial roots, but is precisely the kind of anti-colonial media practice that we need at a moment when we are all being busily promised the capacity to express ourselves in social media, yet being literally mined as a society, having our social worlds mined and transformed into profit for firms. I see social media, particularly Facebook, is a mining operation, mining the social world for value and giving very little back. I see Mary Beth's work as a collaborative community building work with media at its center, but building a shared enterprise. And the last thought I want to offer is our book also, to the extent that Silicon Valley is an emblem of America, one of the things that I was hoping we would achieve, and I think we have achieved it, is a vision in the book of a society of people who are very different, but who can talk to one another, tell one another their stories, be intimately connected even in their difference. And that process, getting to that place, begins with exactly the kind of questions that Mary Beth is asking. Who are you? What's your experience been? What's your life like?
You know, there's so much richness in what you all both have talked about here, because one of the things that makes me think of is how, to Mary Beth's point, it wasn't hard because people are hungry to tell their story because they feel invisible, because there isn't a sense that their story and their lives are part of the collective and dominant narrative that's told. And so they're hungry to shed light on that. And that makes me think of San Mateo County, and I don't know Santa Clara's numbers so well. We're both counties part of Silicon Valley. San Mateo County is 64% people of color. That's not probably what the tech folks that you have talked to think about. At minimum, 64% people of color.
Yeah.
We've been a majority people of color counties since the turn of the century, since 2000. So 2 decades, this has not been news. It's not breaking news. 64% people of color. We have 37% immigrant population.
Right.
of which 57% of children are born into immigrant parents. So this is not going away. This is actually a part of the roots of the future of our county that I think is decades in the making. That is still not a narrative that's told. And what's important about that, and I think, and what you're sharing too, is that this concept of belonging. It's not about commercializing, but about how do you feel a sense of belonging? It requires a sense of connection and a sense of collective understanding of where we fit in. And there's a John Powell at UC Berkeley, the Other and Belonging Institute director. He talks about this very idea that you were talking about, which is how people are so segregated and so differentiated and have so much anxiety, whether it's globalization and now COVID and demographic change, that people in fact hunker down instead of making those connections, instead of reaching out and actually bridging across communities to better understand each other. In fact, we become more divisive, and he talks about breaking. So it's interesting to think about the work that you're doing under this much larger narrative of a sense of belonging versus just, daylighting a different reality.
I want to add one other word here, Shireen. You used the word connection, and I've come to loathe that word, not because of the way you're using it, but because that's the word that Mark Zuckerberg uses.
Yeah.
Supposed to do online, right?
Interesting.
The word that Mary Beth uses that I treasure is relationship. It builds relationships with people. And I think the only way that you can feel like you belong is if you build a relationship with people. And I saw in the chat that someone asked if we're still in touch with the subjects of the book. And Mary Beth, you are, because you've built relationships.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm in touch with, I am in touch with many of the people in the book. I mean, Constance, and I'm looking at the book. That's why I'm looking down to think about who, and John and Steve and Melissa and Geraldine's family. I mean, I think that I was able to bring them copies of this book was published in France in 2018. So I was able to bring everybody copies when I went back in 2019, and then send everybody this book. I got to the end of Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, which I can't stop thinking and talking about. And I started it when it came out, and then I just finished it this summer. And she talks about radical empathy as the only bridge across. And she talks about, I mean, I know that word is overused too, but her whole formula is, I need to, she says, approach the other with a humble heart, with the goal of understanding what life is like from your perspective, not what I would do in your shoes, but what it feels like for you. And so that's, I don't know if we can ever really reach that as humans, especially socialized as we are in terms of race and culture and class. But I just think that's the goal, and that's the goal for all of us. And I just don't think that being on Facebook is getting us there.
I think that's a really beautiful way of differentiating between a transactional connection versus a relationship, which, Isabel Wilkinson does such a great job of talking about these things that are so profound. And, one of the things in the work of equity is also to recognize the side of people who may have the blinders on also. And recognize, how do we build bridges there? And that also takes radical empathy. That takes that radical empathy to open up build those bridges and understand that perspective, not from how you would experience it, but in the way that you just said, which is, if I was in your shoes and I grew up the way that you did, and if I didn't have the experiences that I had, and I didn't read the book that you offer, how do I understand my world? And then finding that on-ramp to build that relationship that could get us to a closer, hopefully brighter future together. And a lot of my work is around changing systems that are perpetuating the inequities. And one of the things that John Powell, that I just erected a minute ago, talks about is being soft on people and hard on systems, because we all breathe this air. So we all breathe this air, and we all are indoctrinated in the ways that we are indoctrinated in the bubbles that we live. And therefore, we need to change the systems that in order to help us see something different. And what I loved about, and it made me curious, and I'm sure there's others that will ask this question, and I want to, after this question, I'd love to turn to the Q&A that's that people have been submitting, is to just ask the process for making this book. It was years long. You went through a series of dates very quickly about France. And, I mean, and it's interesting that it got published in France before we were able to publish it here. I mean, there's a story there that it would be great if you could spend a minute or two on.
Could I tackle that, Mary Beth?
Yeah, sure.
Great. So yeah, so this was actually a supreme challenge for us. It was really surprising. We started the project really in 2017. I got the funding. We found Mary Beth, and it was very exciting to be able to work with her. And as we did the work, we would show it to people, and people said, "Well, that's not Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is tech guys, right?" And at the same time that we were working on the book, National Geographic actually did a story on Silicon Valley. If you go back and find that story, you will see that it is mostly young white programmers on their way to and from Burning Man. And that's one part of the valley for sure, but it's not where we're at. Ironically, the French caught it right away, and they saw it right away. They were happy to publish it, and we shopped it to a series of American publishers, and we both have pretty good track records, and so we could get it looked at. But folks generally said, not going to sell, too expensive, and they literally didn't recognize it. Okay, fast forward to the present, or close to the present, 2019. Joe Calamia, who was an editor at Yale, who tried to buy it at Yale, moved to Chicago, the University of Chicago Press, which is also my home press. It's where I published other books. And once at Chicago, he was able to actually buy the book and, to put it under contract and to get it printed as beautifully as it is. And Mary Beth was able to come back out and shoot more. And, I think we made a new book. And somehow something in America changed in those 2 years so that people could actually see Silicon Valley. And literally editors were like blind to it 2 years ago. Like just like, that's not Silicon Valley, Fred. I mean, I know you live there and you say it is, but it's just not. And so I don't know, Mary Beth, does that sound about like what it was like?
Yeah, it happened to me once before that, photographing my hometown, this post-industrial city, I couldn't get it published anywhere in the US, and they picked it up in France. And then that as this sort of emblem of an American, post-industrial city. So sometimes I think it takes that kind of distance. There was one editor in California, remember, Fred, who said, "This sure is an interesting perspective on Silicon Valley." Like, we were kind of crazy, actually, So,
it just shows how indoctrinated we are into this dominant narrative that actually has a very narrow basis, and yet it sort of sits at the tip of the iceberg, and it's what everyone sees, whereas really it is not the story at all of who we are. But it's both so dominant that people rejected the reality at hand, but also how that then perpetuates that dominant narrative and does not allow space or crack to see the full picture.
No, you literally can't see it. I mean, people can see a picture. I can hold up a picture. They say, well, that's not, I mean, of course you have tuckadees. It's not really a common thing. It's not, I mean, what makes Silicon, whatever. I mean, you know where this goes. And I mean, Shireen, this is such a deep American idea. We are so wedded to this deep individualism and to this idea that there are special people among us, saints. This goes all the way back to 1620 and the Puritans of New England. Somehow God is watching our country. There are special people who are saints, and all the other folks around them, well, they don't really count. And that story, that framework is still all over Silicon Valley. Even if we're not Puritans anymore, even if we don't buy that idea theologically, the idea that there are saints, and by implication, they tend to be white and male, and that God loves them and is rewarding them with wealth on this earth so that, he can show that he loves them, while the rest of us are sort of invisible, as the Native Americans were, say, in Plymouth in 1620. That's a logic that is deeply pernicious. But ironically, Shireen, I think it's the same logic that causes us to fantasize that if we just express ourselves on Mark Zuckerberg's system, we too will become saint-like. And that's just not so.
I can't help but just take a moment to talk about the trauma that creates.
Yeah.
that logic you just talked about, that we're talking about, that invisibility that's perpetuated, that people reject, those are the stories of the people you are telling. They are being rejected. That is a recurring trauma that is constantly happening over and over to the lives of so many people in Silicon Valley. And it gives me goosebumps when you were talking, because we don't talk enough about what the pain that creates, the absolute hunger to want to be seen for the issue, the challenges and the issues and the things, the struggles, and the fact that you're still here. There is a trauma that we continue to perpetuate, that it's going to take that radical empathy and a breakdown of a transformation of our systems in order for us to break through.
I want to say it also has concrete economic effects. If I can pretend that other people aren't there, then I can ignore facts like during the pandemic, 40% of Silicon Valley families could not be guaranteed to have enough to eat on any given day. Think about that number, 4 out of 10 families.
Oh, yeah.
There are more than 70 billionaires in this region, San Mateo and Santa Clara counties together. And yet, 17% of women normally are food insecure, and under pandemic conditions, 40% of families.
Well, let's talk more about the pandemic, because it was raised by Robert T in the chat. And one of the things that they were asking about is how the pandemic may have changed Silicon Valley culture. And while Mary Beth, you're not necessarily living here, Fred, you might have some things to say about that. But I wonder if, Mary Beth, with your relationships that you've built over time, you can share with us if there have been any major changes in some of the lives of the people.
Well, I actually don't know the answer to that question. I mean, to me, the people that I've been in touch with have, their lives have remained stable. But, like Abraham and Brenda, I haven't been able to get in touch with them, and I don't know what's happened to them. So I don't think I can answer that question, since I haven't been there since 2019.
Well, I certainly feel like, I don't know if you all know the writer Arundhati Roy, but I'm a huge fan of hers, and she wrote this early in the pandemic. She wrote an essay that ended with this concept that the pandemic could be a portal, and what we could really use it to come out on a different side. And I'm curious, based on the stories that you've read, and maybe Fred, based on your experience being here, whether you feel like we're making any progress.
I think there's a tremendous effort underway by the people who make large technical systems that interlink people to teach us that somehow it is better that we are isolated in our rooms and talking to each other through screens than collaboratively working together in places. Mary Beth, was that an agreement of disgust, or
so horrible? I think it's probably true, but it's so horrible.
Yeah, but I think it is true, and I don't think that people necessarily don't believe it, but I think that it's grim. I do think that there are so many advantages to being in person in a variety of settings that people will fight to get that back. I see Robert asked what would happen in the Valley. I think the Valley will repopulate very rapidly. I'm surrounded by executives and upper middle class managers for all the major firms, and none of them have left, and they're all looking forward to getting people back into the building. I think it's also very different if you have young kids, if you don't have a high-end job, if you can't work through the screen. So I see the Zoom era as an acceleration of a process of individuation that is pretty pernicious. And I think we've got to be building community in person as much as we possibly can. I think we've got to be going to the library. I think libraries are a perfect place to build community.
There's another question that has come up around this concept of belonging and being part of the story. And Rod mentions that they are staying here only because, really, for the responsibility of caring for their aging family members. And this person, they're very curious about what were some of the reasons that people are staying despite needing to live in a trailer and despite the challenges of living on the streets and in other places.
Well, my experience with people was that it is where the jobs are. That's the problem. So like Cristobal, he's from out in Bakersfield, his family's out in Bakersfield, but he's he comes to Silicon Valley thinking that that's where all the jobs are. And in fact, that is where there's more of an economy for him to be. So maybe he would be in his house with his mom out in Bakersfield, but there wouldn't be the job. So I think that's the disconnect, that the economic opportunities are there, but not the quality of life opportunities.
That makes a lot of sense. Here's more of maybe, you know, I don't know these people, so I'm going to just, Peggy mentions, any comments on the quest for fame and fortune that leads to corruption of ethics? Case in point, Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. Oh, that's right.
Theranos. Fred, do you want to talk about that?
I sure do. I'm just sending a note to Maeve for readings, and I'm happy to name other readings too. Yeah, so how did I even describe it? So I teach at Stanford. I've taught here for 20 years. I really like the place in lots of ways. But when I went to college, back before the dinosaurs stopped roaming the earth, the cool thing to be when you went to college was a poet or a musician or an artist. And here at Stanford, the cool thing to be is someone with a startup. And I think that there's a sort of broad sense that if you're going to express yourself in the world and make a creative statement, you should do it by doing business. And that's what the Theranos story tells. And you know, part of that process is faking it till you make it. And you know, one of the things that we literally almost teach it's sort of how to express yourself, how to hype yourself, how to advertise yourself, how to treat yourself like a brand in ways that allow you to get money before you actually have a product that deserves money. And in many ways, the Theranos story is sad because Elizabeth Holmes just went a little too far. But you know, had her product worked out, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And the line between hype and fraud is very thin. And what scares me is the deeper fraud, I think, of offering folks only this one way to imagine themselves making a contribution in the world, the one way of entrepreneurship in business. There are many ways to make a contribution in the world. And, you know, that's something that's gotten really lost in the process. So Theranos is a symptom of a larger problem.
You know, when Rupi is raising really this notion of white dominance and white culture. And, you know, there is a lot of work out there to really understand, what does white supremacy mean? This isn't something that Rupi has mentioned, but I talk about a lot, because white supremacy isn't necessarily Ku Klux Klan, and it's not necessarily neo-Nazism. It really is this subtle way in which we compare everything to white culture, and there's an invisible sense, a set of rules and advantages that white people experience that really is invisible to them. So it's sort of this invisibility thread that just sort of continues the individual's experience in their own little bubbles as they move through Silicon Valley. And Rupi is really curious about this sort of utter whiteness of Silicon Valley power.
I would love to address that.
You should.
Especially as someone whose daughter calls him the patriarch, you know, but also like I'm a 6'3" white man of a certain generation. And I have had the experience, to my surprise, of walking into rooms where I am instantly taken more seriously and thought to be smarter, visibly thought to be smarter than people around me who are women or people of color or younger, those three categories. And it's actually sort of amazing to me. I mean, a couple of friends and I joke about getting the 10% tall white man discount, right? I mean, we are aware of it. And, you know, I don't know if I would be as aware of it if I didn't have my daughter prodding me constantly and my wife constantly prodding me. I mean, privilege is pretty comfortable, and I might just hang in it. I don't know, but I'm very aware of it. I do want to make one distinction in response to Rupi particularly, and that is between American notions of race and the way that aligns American life, and then sort of more international notions. Because I actually think there's two ways that race gets worked out in the Valley. One way that race gets worked out is the very traditional way that we know, white superiority, white, not white nationalism, but a sort of the kind of thing I was just describing, that 10%, you know, whiteness thing, right? Where you just kind of, it just goes better if you have a white guy in the room. That attitude that's so pernicious. But there's another attitude which is actually quite different. And when I've raised this issue with friends in tech, what they'll say to me is, well, Fred, I mean, yeah, that's right. That does happen. But you know, Fred, that our leader is from India and we're desperately recruiting from China. And, you know, there's a way in which race and whiteness become visible at particular moments and get submerged at others. And I think that's a really tricky thing. And so there's I don't know, maybe I'm getting tangled up here, but I think it's a thing that pops up and pops down. It's hard to explain.
Is it just to draw out this point you're trying to make? Is it that in faced with this concept of white supremacy or white culture within Silicon Valley, people start to pick and choose who they lift up as people of color and put in the front lines, but don't recognize that they are still part of a white culture, white dominant system that picks and chooses how those people can also enter. So when we talk about this concept of belonging, we talked about how inclusion doesn't mean belonging. Just because you invite someone to the room doesn't mean that they actually have an opportunity to change systems and structures. Right. And also all of people of color have also been, you know, not everyone is built alike, and our many vast cultures. I myself am Middle Eastern and identify as a person of color. And we all have within many of our cultures, white supremacy reigns as well, or caste systems. And so colorism, there's a lot of that we can't brush under with some simplistic answers by lifting up one or two individuals of color in leadership.
Totally agree. And I want to flag something that Mary Beth flags a lot, which is the question of class. Race and ethnicity intersect with the distribution of actual resources. You know, and the hunger rates are substantially higher for Mexican Americans and African Americans in the Valley than they are for folks of my hue.
I want to just lift up, Rupi wanted to, I think, punctuate this point that it is the dominance of white experience and thought that is very pervasive. And Fred well said, what you describe is the ultimate in white privilege, since that gives everyone, you say, some instant credibility and gravitas. Thank you all for the great talk.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm trying to figure it out.
I want to lift up this question that Robert has had up here, and I think I'm going to try to interpret it and see if this is correct or not. But really, it looks like, you know, you have this beautiful imagery, Mary Beth, and how do you ensure that there's a compelling story to tell with it? Or do you take a lot of amazing photos and then some of the stories don't come along and so they don't make the book? Or what's that like?
That is an interesting question. And I wish I knew the numbers. I mean, part of it is the research, and part of it is who I meet on a certain day, and part of it is just sort of gut instinct, and part of it is like, oh my God, look at the light and the way it's falling on that person. So it's all a big tilling of the soil the whole time. Is it John? Oh, I can't remember. Robert. I mean, it's like swimming in a stream, and it doesn't work, and then somehow I'm just like going down this stream with this person, and it's all working, and the story, I can't really explain it. It's not very scientific. I mean, I meet and talk with a lot of people that don't end up becoming a photograph, Robert, you know, but somehow whatever the magic is that happens. I mean, Imelda is one of my favorite pictures in the book, and she was in front of my house, and I just ran out and introduced myself and said, could we talk? And I told her what I was doing, and her story was amazing, and their place. And I mean, everybody has an amazing story. I don't think that I answered that very well at all. It's super circular, but it just goes to show you my process is kind of like that too. All over the place and circular, and kind of just.
The thing about working with you, Mary Beth, is that I remember, so we used to meet every Wednesday night while Mary Beth was working and have dinner and go through what she'd been doing. And, you know, she would come to my house with a million images and these notebooks, like, you know, filled with notes about the conversations that she'd been having with people. And I think, Robert, something that I was struck by in Mary Beth's process is that she listens so acutely and sponges up the stories of everyone, but then edits really carefully and pulls out the part that might be hard to see in more ordinary conversation, just as the images really edit down often the beauty of the person, you know, and make it stand out and punch out. Mary Beth, I think, has a way of finding the heart of a story and making that visible in a very short space.
Well, it's just a reminder of that this is an art, that there is an art to this is about the emotion and the heart and some innate understanding inside that logic can't quite describe. You spoke about the front of the book, the picture of the front of the book, how what caught your attention was the light and the image, and yet there was then, you know, ended up being this deeper relationship that you built in an amazing story that made the cover. So there's a great question here that John has raised about the perpetuation of the Silicon Valley myth, and what, to the extent, what's the role of schools, I feel is really the question here. Are they perpetuating it? And just kind of building on that, what's their role of trying to really help students see something else and make the invisible visible for them?
I don't know the answer to that, Fred. Do you? I mean, I know that in the schools, say, for example, in Palo Alto, I mean, I don't know, I would only be guessing, but there's, you know, through Steve and Melissa and through Cara and through talking about what kind of environment are kids being raised in. I mean, it seems like a very ambitious sort of environment in which going to Stanford is a goal. But in East Palo Alto, it may, you know, I think that people are well aware that the opportunities can be different for kids, or a place like East Palo Alto or Redwood City. But I'm not sure about that. Fred, what do you think?
Yeah, I think schools, especially in the elementary, middle, and high school level, schools are under enormous pressure from all sides. I think trying to be a teacher in a school, as you know, my sister is and other relatives are. My father was a high school teacher. You know, those folks. You know, they're under constant reigning pressure to meet many demands. And I think that what they often have to do is respond to the same mythology that we've been trying to undercut. If you're a high school teacher in Kansas and you want your students to succeed in the new world, and the picture of that new world comes from Wired magazine, then you're going to try to give kids the Apple computers that seem to be the devices that will give them access to the wired world being born. And, you know, imagine their distress when they discover that, in fact, no, they're working in a call center or whatever. My point is that schools that are focused to some degree on STEM education for helping students get jobs may inadvertently be leading them deeper into a mythology that doesn't actually help them do anything. Here at Stanford, we're working very hard to solve this problem. My whole teaching career is devoted to trying to offer humanistic, social, qualitative, social scientific approaches to understanding the social world to people whose primary employment will be in technical spheres. And I just think that's incredibly important. Humanists have a real role, but in earlier grades, I don't really even know how to think about it.
I'm sure there's a lot of, there are teachers on here that might have some thoughts, but that's for another panel. I'm going to just put one more question before we start to think about closing out, but it's a kind of a broad one about, you know, maybe you could elaborate this theme of humanity and the emotional cost of living in Silicon Valley based on your experiences with the stories and the people you met.
Well, I mean, I think that you want to go first, Fred?
I want you to go first. Thanks.
I mean, I think that the human cost, we've touched on the human cost, you know, throughout our hour together. And, you know, I was thinking about an earlier comment that if the ways in which we justify our own separateness, whether that's because of race or religion or culture or class, and all of the ways in this, let's just take this country, for example, that we have defined ourselves out of connecting with one another, in that we all breathe the same air. What did you say, Shireen? You made there's a great quote. You said something beautiful about that. My hope for this book is that it allows some of those divisions to drop as a reader is experiencing the work or experiencing the people in the work. And so once we do sort of make a human connection or realize that we can kind of cut through those dividers, that maybe people will then bring their responsibility to bear on whatever their sphere of influence is in the Valley, or whatever their sphere of influence is in the economy in general. So, I mean, my wish for the book is that everyone who's working in economics or business or healthcare or schools sees into these stories something that they hadn't known before, and make a connection and think about a change that they can make in their own world. I mean, we talked about me coming to do a master class at Stanford to send Stanford students out doing photography in Silicon Valley. And I said, no, I've already did that book. That book is done. Bring your expertise, all of your engineers and your economists and everyone who's studying at Stanford, bring your expertise to bear on what needs to happen so that these fellow humans of ours can share a bigger piece of the pie and have a quality of life that's more equitable. So, I mean, anyway, I think that's—
I want to offer a hopeful vision. So,
yeah.
You know, I'm immensely distressed by what was for a long time the monopoly hold that the tech industry had on optimism and the future. They said, you know, we're the future. We're going to build the future for you all, and you all are going to like it. And for a while, we sure did. Boy, that iPhone of mine, you know, when yeah, whatever. I mean, you know, those machines are pretty amazing. But that's not where the heart of America lies, or the heart of our future lies. You know, if we're going to build the kind of America that we actually want to live in, we've got to get our eyes down from the sky and back onto the ground where we actually live. We need to stop looking at our Facebook pages and start looking at one another. Talk to one another. Do politics in our bodies together. Ask your neighbor who may be very different from you, what's up. I mean, I had the experience, so just forgive my total ignorance. I had no idea what Diwali was. I made me pronouncing it wrong. And I went to my neighbor's house. He had all these decorations up. And, you know, it's like, what are you guys doing? It's not Halloween quite yet. Well, total ignorance, right? But he was very patient with me, and you know, we've become, you know, loose friends, right? Neighbor friends, and it's kind of wonderful. That stuff is just really basic. I hope that our book offers a vision of an America that everybody who picks it up can feel themselves a part of. And you may not see anybody who looks quite like you. You may not see any life stories quite like your own, but you can see that you have a place, and that if Mary Beth finds you, she'll make a beautiful picture of you. And she'll tell your story, and you know, you'll be heard, and that you belong in America, and that America is your country, it's your land, and it's our land together. And that's the paradox. It's yours and it's ours.
That's not the point, though, for me to come and take their picture. The point is they don't need me for that. The point is nobody needs me for that. You know, that those human, you talk about the human connection. Those human connections are always possible. I just happen to have a camera. But
all I meant was that the book was an emblem of the kind of world that we want to inhabit. That's all I was trying to say.
I know what you meant, but let's not make connecting with strangers a specialized thing that only Mary Beth with her camera can do. That's not the right message. The right message is that's, you know, that I'm just standing in for the public. I'm just standing in for what's possible between people.
I like that.
Well, I appreciate the vision of really wanting to create more human relationships, wanting to elevate the reality of where people live, wanting to make sure that the humanity of Silicon Valley in all of its forms is shared, and that the narrative is corrected in many ways. So I appreciate that. And I think the one thing I would say before I completely close out is just that as people review this book, I really want people to think about the concepts of justice versus charity, and really not this turn into this radical empathy, turn into a sense of charitable acts, but really how do we shift power and privilege? So with that, I want to just thank you, Mary Beth and Fred, for the insightful discussion and presentation. Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. Really wonderful questions. I'm sorry we were running out of time. I could have talked to these two lovely people forever. I'm sure you all could have as well. Such amazing stories. We really do. Please check out our upcoming author talks at the I think that we will probably put a URL. It's on the library website, and I'm going to put it in the chat here. And certainly check out the book if you haven't already. We hope that you have a chance to take a look at it, and also check out other offerings from these two lovely people. So thank you all very much for being with us
tonight. Shireen. Thank you, Jenna. Thank you, library. And thank you all for being here. Really, really nice. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.